Section 2, Chapter 8, A Traitor to Himself. We had gone to a flat in Munich, which was the home of a young German lawyer. He was passionately anti-Nazi, and had been most anxious that we should meet some of his friends in the legal profession, that they might tell us how bitterly they deplored the degradation into which they felt Germany had fallen, and how they resented the fact that all decent standards of justice were being subordinated to Nazi aims and manipulations. The night we met the lawyers, we had to take great precautions about our meeting. We were all to travel by different routes and to arrive at different times. It was deeply moving to see the intense relief and delight it was to these young lawyers to be able to tell us what they were thinking, and as one of them said, to meet English scholars and to realize that sanity still existed outside Germany, if not within. Our host had written a long paper which he read, and then we asked many questions. As the party drew to a close, one of the German lawyers present said, "Perhaps the best illustration we could give you of the kind of slavery into which we have fallen is to point out that if a Gestapo man knew of this meeting and of what we have been saying, it is certain we should all be in a concentration camp very quickly, and it is possible that some of us might be shot. Dr. Sachs, the lawyer who read the paper, will have to burn it in case his home is searched." Now I want to recall another evening with the Nazis. This time we could go openly to the Nazi house, and there was no anxiety about the meeting. We were welcomed by Dr. Hartmann and his young wife, also a keen Nazi, and 3 or 4 youth leaders and teachers together with 3 boys aged from 14 to 16. One, I think, was the younger brother of Frau Hartmann. The other 2 were his friends. As we were drinking coffee, our host said, "I found, since I saw you yesterday, that one of the most important younger Nazi leaders in our Ministry of Culture is in Munich for a few days, so he will come and open the discussion tonight. Sometimes the English papers say of the Nazis that they are not intellectual. I can assure you Dr. Weber is brilliant, and I think he will make you understand that all Nazis are not unintelligent." Just as Dr. Hartmann finished speaking, the door opened, and Dr. Karl Weber came in. I realized at once that I knew him, and on shaking hands I recalled where we had met. "But surely, Dr. Weber, you remember we have met before. About 3 years ago we were together at an international student conference in Switzerland, where we discussed Christianity and internationalism late into the night." Dr. Weber was obviously embarrassed that his Nazi friend should hear this, and was quite determined that I should pursue the subject no further. He replied rather coldly, "Oh yes, but those were the days in which we lived in a kind of fantasy about the League of Nations. Now, thank God, we in this country have become realists, and know that neither Christianity nor the League of Nations could save Germany from destruction." At this point, others came up to be introduced, and I had no further chance of talking to him. After coffee, we settled down to listen to Karl Weber, and at first I found it difficult to concentrate on what he was saying, because I was so interested in his face. The marks of a deep conflict were all too apparent, and his thinly veiled cynicism could not hide his unhappiness. It seemed as though he had sold his soul to this movement, and as I reflected, I realized what the temptation had been. Dr. Weber had been among the thousands of unemployed intellectuals, and now he was in a really important state post, and was looked up to, not only by young Nazis, but by many who greatly admired the skill with which he expressed their theories in high-sounding intellectual phrases, and who found in him a past master in the art of rationalizing Nazi actions. Dr. Weber talked to us for more than an hour, and then answered questions for another hour. I must select some of the points he made, which seemed to me to explain what I mean by the fundamentally religious appeal to the Nazi youth in much of the teaching given to them. However, I am concerned with trying to show how plausible it all sounded to young Germans with no particular religious intellectual or moral standards by which to judge what was being said, a generation who even in early years had been faced with uncertainty about their future. Many of them were sons and daughters of unhappy parents who had not recovered from the last war and were far too bewildered themselves to be good guides to their children. And many also had older brothers unemployed and bitter. A very astute traveler in Europe in 1925 remarked, "The old world is dead and the new is waiting to be born." That was profoundly true, and none could have dreamed that so terrible a new world would be born in Central Europe. I must not enlarge further on this point, but I am convinced that we shall never rightly assess the full significance, and indeed the full dangers of this movement, if we fail to realize who were the eager disciples of this new faith, and unless we understand something of their background and of the genuine human needs they felt were satisfied by Nazi teaching. But to get back to Dr. Weber, with his tense, unhappy face, as he started to address us. "I find my English friends talk a great deal about loss of freedom in Germany, and yet as they travel in this country they must become aware that the youth seems much freer, and certainly much happier than for many years. Even the more prejudiced foreigners have told me of their amazement at this outburst of new life, energy, and purpose. There are many reasons I could give you for this, but I will select a few, though I must first remind you that people mean very different things when they speak of freedom. I am not going to enter into the various aspects such as freedom from foreign domination, freedom from economic slavery, freedom from poverty or unemployment. You know of these and many others, but I want to suggest to you that the younger generation in Germany needed above all the freedom that comes from security. And that kind of security I mean is that which comes to those who give complete obedience to an authority they know they can trust. For youth in Germany, the terrible time of uncertainty is over. In National Socialism, they are finding the reason for their existence, the chance of living fully and with a purpose. The state control of the young in Germany today is not to be thought of as tyranny and oppression, but rather it is control or care in the same sense that in former days the Church undertook the responsibility for her children. In the Middle Ages, the Church was concerned about the whole life of man, and man gained a sense of freedom from trusting in the authority and judgment of the Church in all important departments of his life. When man broke from the family of the Church, he drifted more and more into individualism. Strength and security began to fail him, and by degrees he felt himself not so much free as desolate. In Germany you have seen the greatest extreme of individualism, and you have also seen the greatest collapse. In this situation the Führer arose, and now the German state gathers men, not back into the broken bits of various churches which are relics of the past, but instead into the great family of the German Reich. It offers the young the same authority, the same strength, and the same freedom, and that comes from an unquestioning belief in a creed and a way of life. It is also true that just as the Church did not ask the individual to formulate his own faith and creed, so we do not ask the young Nazi to do this either. He must enter into the faith without a question. He may not understand it all, he may not even like it all, but he must realize that the wisdom of the state is greater than his own. But I must here remind you, continued Dr. Weber, that when a young man becomes a good Nazi, it is not so much intellectual change as a yielding to a new and comprehensive view of life, and he will find much joy and a sense of release in following it. Foreigners find this difficult to understand because they use their own conceptions in interpreting it. Nazi philosophy cannot be explained in terms of any previous ideas, for it is bound up with the historic fate of the German people. In National Socialism, the ideas of race and community represent a new experience of reality which has come almost like a revelation to many of us. We may still share with you and with all mankind in the political and economic crisis in the world, continued Dr. Weber, but in what you regard as merely political events in 1933, we found a new experience of existence. This experience belongs to the realm of the Unsagbar. We feel we must begin here with that which is new in life. From this experience we begin to see that the distinction between private and public must disappear. And we have made the discovery of the great reality of cooperation within the family of the German race. For all now, especially for the young, we recognize the authority of sacrifice, of decision, of responsibility, and of absolute obedience. This, for us all, is a great educational and, I would say, inspirational event, a transition from an attitude which merely enjoys reality theoretically to one which recognizes the demand of reality. The Führer experienced in the last war that the eternal values of a common human life and fellowship were discovered by men under stress of war, which led to new respect among all classes. It was in complete opposition to this discovery that the acute class conflict arose again in our country in post-war years. The National Socialistic Revolution is the reassertion that the common fate of blood and race are more profound than any class distinctions. You will see that our philosophy has reacted against abstract theories, and that we now have the concrete conceptions of Blut und Boden, and we believe that all culture is based on and bound up with race. It is plain to all who are willing to see that this philosophy involves a call to the younger generation to heroic living, for this reality of race is something which claims them, gives them a standard, and orients their whole life. This great inspiration does not only come from intellectual conceptions. It comes because there has been called forth in this country what we term a deep feeling for life, Lebensgefühl, which is inevitably bound up with the fact of blood and race. The Führer expresses what all of us in some measure have experienced, that we have passed from mere existence into inexhaustible life. Then he made a most significant comment. Theology in Germany has been very largely what we call an unobedient theology, that is, a theology which is mainly thinking about God, not a standing before the demands of a living God. Our philosophy puts obedience to the demands of reality as essential for every young National Socialist. Some of us could scarcely keep quiet any longer, especially as the youths in the group were drinking in all he said. So we interrupted. Do excuse us, Herr Doctor, but could we ask some questions about all this? I would be glad, he said, if you would allow me to develop one other important point in relation to this, and then we can have a discussion on it all. I spoke earlier of youth being lonely and in need of fellowship. It is true that there were all sorts of idealistic youth movements, and especially international youth movements, but the Führer has shown us that it is ridiculous to think of a world fellowship. Men can only be creative within a fellowship they can recognize, one that has certain limitations. The World Fellowship of Youth is like the League of Nations, only a hazy figment of the imagination that crumbles as soon as political difficulties arise. But the Fellowship of German Youth is a real thing, and every member of the Hitler Jugend knows to what he belongs, and that he has himself an important part to play. He knows also that he does not play that part for himself, but for the sake of the community. But, we said, in this family, What is the place of the German Jew? And indeed, what is the place of anyone who opposes the National Socialists? Only the flash in his dark eyes revealed the fact that Dr. Weber was a traitor to himself as he replied, "Again, let me refer you to the Church in the Middle Ages. The Church knew it was the faith that mattered, and showed in the Inquisition what she could do with those who were heretics. Germany and the destiny of Germany is what matters, and even if we are thought ruthless or cruel, we must exclude all who would poison the life of the state." On this point we challenged him again and again, but we could get no further. In fact, the more we pressed, the more extreme did Dr. Weber become. Even the young boys joined in this part of the discussion, and talked of the Jews as the great evil they must fight relentlessly. We realized that, in an almost religious sense, they had created their own devil against whom they must wage ceaseless warfare. So we returned again to the question of opposition within the party, saying to Dr. Weber, "Surely Germany is famed for her critical mind and for her standards of scholarship. It seems to us wildly unlikely that even among National Socialists you all agree. Can a good National Socialist oppose certain things the party teaches or does and be safe? The fact that you all give the same sort of parrot answers to our questions puzzles us, because we cannot believe that suddenly you all agree about these important points, especially such things as the race problems, when the whole world is against your decisions and teachings." Hard-pressed, but with complete urbanity, Dr. Weber replied, "Let me put it this way. It is obvious that there are different points of view in the party, and often different points of emphasis, and anyone in the party has within its councils the right to put his own point of view. We express this by saying, innerhalb des Glaubens. Many points of view may be held. Again, let me compare it with the Church. Within the councils of the Church there was often serious disagreement, but early Christian missionaries did not display or discuss their doctrinal disputes with the heathen." At this we laughed, feeling we must be the heathen. But Dr. Weber rounded on us with passion and said, "I would go further and say if the Christian missionaries in the world today had kept their differences to themselves and given only the message on which they were united, there might be more Christians in the world. It is not very impressive when men parade their quarrels before those they would convert. We feel youth at least must be saved from the confusions and uncertainties which even the Church presents." Then, recovering his composure, he added more persuasively, "Believe me, any contribution that any good party member has to make is very carefully considered and often accepted, but no one in the party may organize opposition if his opinion is not accepted. Not only have we now got this recognizable fellowship in which each young National Socialist knows he has a part to play, but you may be surprised to learn that, to a far greater extent than in any other youth movement, I know our National Socialist songs constantly remind us of our spiritual fellowship with those who have died in our cause. I would remind you of such favorite songs sung so often by National Socialists, such as Ich hau einen Kameraden, or the lines of Rost Wessel, where we recognize the spiritual fellowship of our fallen comrades. The Führer has thus instilled into youth not only all the inspiration of a visible fellowship on earth, but strengthens it by the constant recognition of the fellowship of the spiritual world." It was many hours before that discussion ended. We felt we had made no impression on Dr. Weber or Dr. Hartmann, because their very fear of facing any conflict made them fanatical in their defense of what they knew to be largely false. In the younger, less intellectual Nazis present, we had a very good example of Dr. Weber's theory that they really had passed through some personal experience, and that, however false the teaching they had accepted, they were quite impervious to intellectual assault. In our hotel that night we talked it over, for we had been partially interrupted in what Dr. Weber had said about recognizing fellowship. I believe this is an important point, because in a world where so many barriers are being broken down, the group becomes too big for the average individual to grasp. It may have been easy for John Wesley to think of the world as his parish, but for most of us, the world is far too vague. We realized as we talked that even in our lifetime, many of the more familiar groups to which we had belonged had now largely disappeared. Most of us in childhood were taught to think of ourselves as within a certain class and a religious denomination, and we were all either a little liberal or else a little conservative. Many such barriers are becoming less marked, and possibly we have not realized that, good as may be their passing in some ways with the knitting together of the world so closely by modern means of transport, we find ourselves in a very large and intangible setting. Hitler struck a powerful note when he told his youth that though they were in a wide, rich, and diverse fellowship, it was a fellowship they could comprehend, and in which they could play their part individually. Also, it was clear how some of the young had been deceived by the kind of argument that Dr. Weber put forward so skillfully. We even wondered how far the youth in Great Britain, growing up without definite religious teaching and fellowship, would be proof against false teaching, given similar circumstances. What appalled us was that Dr. Weber and the young master in whose house we met should be such traitors to themselves. I was almost relieved when I heard later that Karl Weber had already broken down once, and that the doctor whom he had consulted, a courageous non-Nazi, had told him he could do nothing for him physically or psychologically until he had the courage to be honest with himself. When Weber left that nursing home and recovered sufficiently to return to work, the party, with their usual skill, sent him off to Japan or somewhere far afield with a group of Nazi students to visit foreign universities and to teach them something of German culture and tradition. It was a clever move because Weber would not need to produce much of the Nazi stuff he disbelieves, and would be able to give a good many perfectly honest and rather brilliant lectures on Germany. And as he was the head of this particular mission, he would not be under further Nazi supervision. That, I imagine, would stave off a further breakdown for a while, but for how long? As far as I can see, the most cruel and ruthless elements in the party are in the first place those who have seen in a movement based on force the chance for the free play of their own more brutal tendencies, and in the second place, the intellectual who is a complete traitor to himself. The latter type is, I think, very likely to become a cruel oppressor of anyone who makes him conscious of his self-betrayal. When I thought of Dr. Weber in former years and remembered he was not ignorant like many Nazi leaders, but did really know the meaning of Christianity, both practical and theoretical, I was horrified to see him using his scholarship for something he knew quite well to be false. A friend of his told me he thought the reason was that Karl Weber had always been ambitious, and this enormous opportunity of gaining power and prestige in the party was too great a temptation. I did not believe his self-deception could last, but while it did, He was a skillful and powerful tool in the hands of the party leaders. I believe Hitler himself looked upon him as a marked man. I wonder what his end will be. Probably like Judas, he will go out into the night.